You're on Long Final, Ireland's aviation podcast from Squawk 7000.
Noel Flynn, welcome to Long Final from Squawk 7000. I have been so looking forward to having a chat with you on multiple levels. One, for the very fact that if there's anybody who has, I think, a lot of time on the Boeing 747, it's probably yourself. But another aircraft that I'm going to whet our listeners' appetites with as well will be the DC-3. So two airplanes that certainly arouse a certain level of passion for people when it comes to aviation. Let's find out a little bit about you. Where are you from?
Well, the surname of Flynn, obviously there's a link to Ireland, Michael, and my great-grandfather was born in Cork. I was born up in South Africa where he had moved to. And my dad, being in engineering in South African Airways, we lived close to the airport at Johannesburg. And of course, there was the catalyst for our enthusiasm for aviation, because instead of paying attention at classrooms, we were looking at airplanes in the circuit at Joburg. So that's where it originated from, born in South Africa a long time ago.
Well, that's so funny because that's a story I've already heard so many times of young people looking out the window, maybe when they should be looking in, and also being a bit of an airport brat or airport baby. Did you get out to the airfield often?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, the biggest highlight of our lives was spending a day with my dad at work, and my brother Hugh, who's been in Ireland for the last 27 years. We had spent the whole day sitting in the cockpit of Viscounts and 707s, and that actually introduced me to a fortunate situation, Michael, in that a friend of my dad's was in the simulator section at South African Airways, and he formed a flying club called the Flying Springbox Aero Club at Rand Airport, southeast of Johannesburg downtown. And as a schoolboy, I used to cycle to Rand Airport, and my function was the odd job fellow. You know, I cleaned the hangars and washed the aeroplanes, and in return, instead of any payment, it was to get a flip as the last thing of the day. So, yeah, I was set. That was the catalyst, of course.
What were you flying?
They had 3 Cherokee 140s, and they had just purchased one of the first Cherokee Arrows, the 200. And so I'd often be in the back of the Arrow when they were doing IF to look out for other traffic. They had a Tiger Moth, and sadly I lost the logbook, but I accumulated about 300 hours just as a schoolboy. As I say, being taken for rides after a day of cleaning, which is wonderful background for any young guy to start.
Do you remember your first solo?
Oh, very much so. I joined the South African Airforce, and that happened in the Air Force. I straight after school went to the Air Force, and the basic trainer was the Harvard at T6. And the first solo on that was something I'll never forget. I'm not sure I was quite ready for it, but what a fantastic trainer to start a career on. It was wonderful, yes.
The decision to go into the Air Force, was that an extension of your love of aviation, or were there any other motivations for it?
Good question. Actually, it was, of course, I had my eye on flying fast jets, which was the big lure, but the ultimate goal was getting into the airline. And there was a period where I absolutely loved life in the Air Force, but I never lost that the ultimate goal of progressing towards the airline, as most young guys do. The Air Force was fun, and we timed it perfectly, Michael, in that there was a gentleman by the name of Dick Lord, who was South African born, but flew for the Fleet Air Arm and was subsequently seconded to the US Air Force. And he flew lots of lovely stuff, and was one of the co-founders of the Red Flag exercise in the United States. Now, I presume I'm talking around the late 60s. He retired, and when he went back to South Africa, the South African Air Force obviously sought his services, and he revolutionized the South African Air Force in putting young guys back into jets instead of the old group. So I was lucky, as my whole career was, Michael, that I was at the right time at the right place and managed to fly some very nice airplanes.
And we're talking about the 1970s primarily at that particular time.
Indeed. This was, I actually left the Air Force in 1979. So it was a period between 74 and 1979.
What was it like in South Africa at that particular time? Were there calls on the Air Force at any stage? Did you see any flying in anger?
Yes, and I very interesting question, Michael. as a young guy, I was in my early 20s. The objective for me was, of course, the fun of flying. I got into flying Sabres and Mirage 3s, but the goal for me was a Buccaneer, which we were the only Air Force other than the UK forces that flew the Buck. And we did see military action. As I say, I saw it as the greatest thing in the world, not withstanding the fact that the political influence was something else. But the exercises were dramatically exciting for a young guy like myself. Yeah.
And then the airlines beckoned.
Yes. I still shiver in my shoes when I had to go to my OC and tell him I was resigning to join the airline because, I had to break my contract. And of course, I had to go to the bank manager too and get some money to buy myself out of the South African Airforce. And joined SAA the day after I left the Air Force in mid-1979. And in those days, we joined the airline as second officers. In South African Airways, it was called a boy pilot. And there were other ruder names than that, but I best not go there, Michael. But it was lovely. The first 18 months was spent as a cruise relief pilot. And then we progressed on to the 737. But actually, coincidentally, the airline was short of pilots at the time. So we continued our role as second officers on the Jumbo while flying as first officers on the 737, which ultimately meant that by the time I did my conversion as a first officer on 747s, I spent just on 40 years on Jumbos, which was lovely. I was really lucky. And I suppose if you're going to get stuck on an aeroplane, that's probably the one to be stuck on.
I'm thinking about the actual flights. You must be talking fairly long distances.
In SA, when we started off, of course, politically, South African Airways was banned from flying up Africa. So, excuse me, a lot of the flights would do a sort of tech stop at Sal Island, in the Cape Verde Islands. However, there were those that they tried to get into Frankfurt, Zurich, London. And in the event you ran short of gas, we'd lob into Lisbon if the winds were not as, and of course, were never as reliable as we have them today. But yeah, long sectors.
The variants, what numbers did you fly in the 747?
Oh, man. I feel a bit chuffed. Thank you for that question, Michael. I was lucky to fly all variants except for the 100 series.
Wow.
Which, was now, forgive me for my lack of education, but I think Aer Lingus flew the 100
They did.
series.
The first two were the hundreds, yeah.
Yeah, and that's the only one I missed. But luckily, the 200, the Combi, the 300, SP, 400, and then eventually the Dash 8, which was lovely, absolutely wonderful.
Tell our listeners about the SP, the baby jumbo.
Lovely. It was very much more maneuverable than what the 200 series was. Of course, the power was spectacular because they had the same engine. And if I remember correctly, the aeroplane weighed about 50, 60 odd tons less at maximum upweight. So, of course, it performed beautifully. You'd go straight up to at least level 350 after takeoff, which was wonderful, but then end up in the 40s, 1,000 feet, of course, I'm talking of. There was no auto throttle on those airplanes in those days other than for autoland. So the engineer had quite a hard time on the SP because of the short fuselage. It was somewhat speed unstable in turbulence. So the poor engineer was fighting thrust levers all night, either doing Mach 9 or stalling, one of the two. But a fun aeroplane.
Do you remember the transition from having a flight engineer to being a two-pilot crew? What was the impact of that on 747 crews?
I really missed the flight engineer. They were not only such good resource on the flight deck, their technology was fantastic, Michael. But I was fortunate enough to do the original 400 course at Boeing. And I suppose that created some sort of mystique and excitement to getting onto the airplane without a flight engineer. And the systems were so logically and well presented that the workload actually enabled the operation without the flight engineer. So in hindsight, it was a sad day to lose the vital third man in the cockpit. But having said that, Boeing presentation of a fine airplane like the 400 certainly enabled the technical support that was there.
Tell me about any trips you had to Seattle Did you meet any interesting characters?
Oh, golly. Yeah, I went to Seattle once or twice just to visit friends. But if I may bore you with a story, Michael, when I joined Cargolux, one of the flight engineers in Cargolux on the 200 series, which they still had, not that I flew them, was a good friend of Mr. Joe Sutter, who everyone knows was the designer of the 747. Joe used to come and play in the Cargolux golf tournament every year. And I had the opportunity of having a few holes with him and enjoying dinner with him. But the luck was having him on board the airplane, flying him back to Seattle. And he was about to write his book, which I'm sure many have read, but if not, it's a must, the 747. And he was telling me about the upcoming book. And just to listen to the inside tale of this wonderful man was really spectacular. But in all his technical excellence, Michael, he was such a humble fellow too, you know. A unique story was we were flying into Seattle in descent, and we had a company frequency that we would contact. And he knew this, and he had on a piece of paper written a phone number, and he said, would I mind calling or asking the office staff to call the taxi for him when he arrived? And I thought, sure, of course we'd do that. But I thought, surprising a man of his stature would need to phone a taxi. Of course, it was no such thing. The police escort and the VIP cars that were waiting for him as a really Mr. VIP of Seattle was dramatic, to say the least. But what a lovely experience to meet him. It's fantastic. I'll never forget that.
You mentioned Cargolux there, obviously, as we transitioned from South African Airlines. When did that happen, and what was the driver behind that?
That happened in 1993, Michael. I'd spent about 3 years at that stage on the 400. And Cargolux were about to introduce the first 400 freighter and wanted some experience on type. And I was at that stage one of the senior co-pilots still in South African Airways. And a contract was offered, and I went there for 1 year and never left. It was a lovely experience. They offered me a job, of course. I was somewhat keen to get back to South African Airways, but one of the offers in the lure was a command on the 747, and that was something I couldn't turn down. So I spent 27 years with Cargolux and loved every minute of it. It really is a wonderful job. I would really promote it for any young guy that's looking for a good career in long-range operation.
Based in Luxembourg?
Based in Luxembourg. The uniqueness of it was the fact that it's so central in Europe. The tiny country of Luxembourg doesn't warrant that sort of operation, but certainly Europe does. And it was really unique. Of course, set up by originally Icelandair. They did a fantastic job, and the company just boomed to where they are now with in excess of 30 jumbos and a fantastic operation. Of course, strange little situation, and that every crisis that's hit the planet in the last 10, 20, 30 years has been such beneficial repercussion to Cargolux, especially last year. Tragically enough, they had the best year on record. So it's swings and roundabouts, as we know. But a fine airline. It was very nice to work with them.
There's often a certain misunderstanding about some pilots about the difference between, passenger flights versus cargo as a career. And dare I say, even a little bit of snobbery.
Yeah, those cargo pilots are snobs. No, I'm joking. No, I'm joking. It's it's changed. Of course, going back in the old days, the tough old days of the cargo pilots at night was serious, and they faced an uphill battle. The job today is very much refined, and the operation in the flight deck is, as I know it, is exactly the same as whether it's passenger or cargo operation, Michael. But it's very nice. And what made me enjoy Cargolux so much is, of course, the route structures. The company, of course, hasn't got the infrastructure to support as a main carrier would do, passenger operation being. But the function and job-wise is very nice. And they sought after jobs today. We had numerous pilots. In fact, I would say 50% of our pilots come from passenger operations, like in mainland Germany, Lufthansa's and KLM's pilots joined Cargolux. Good job.
Did you have many Irish crew with you in Cargolux?
Not many, but there were some. In fact, on the 200, I'm sure some of our members would know this. And there was a very nice gentleman who I never got to fly with called Bernie Black. And he spent many years with Cargolux. But of course, the one that I actually have to mention is Camilla Tsahn. And now Camilla was in Aer Lingus. and met a Luxembourgish chap and married and moved to Luxembourg and joined Cargolux. And she was the first lady to join Cargolux and became a TRE. In fact, today is a senior examiner on the jumbo. And if I may use the term, a class act. She has really done the ladies in aviation proud in that she's a perfect example of a lady conducting the job properly. And to date, I think there are 20-odd ladies in Cargolux all doing a fine job. Irish pilots, there have been 2 or 3 guys recently that joined in the last 2 years. But of course, the more the merrier. Every time there's been an Irish pilot, he or she has been extremely popular, which is lovely.
Noel, we're talking about your time in Cargolux. I'm curious as well, because of the nature of the flying, did you ever find yourself in any unusual destinations?
The company flew to some very unusual places. I didn't get the opportunity to do them all because probably 30% of the company's work was as charter. One of the most interesting places I went to, strangely enough, by pure coincidence, was a place called Uppington in South Africa, which is very hot and high. And it is somewhat known, Michael, because the airport, specifically the runway they built there, was in excess of 5,000 meters long, I do believe. Built on 2 purposes. One being SAA were thinking of trying to use it as a better airport for departures to try and get into Europe. It is 1,000-foot lower elevation than Johannesburg, and of course the longer runway would enable it. But of course it was used as an emergency stop. Not that it was used, excuse me, for the shuttle.
Okay.
It was an opportunity. So we used to fly down there with motor cars for most of the German manufacturers to do hot and high testing. And it was a most interesting little place because in the desert, the village was built around the Orange River, which flowed copiously through the town. And we used to go and spend a couple of days in the middle of this place. Beautiful. And of course, all these often famous drivers would be there testing these cars. So, yeah, most unusual. Interesting.
The way you're describing it, Noel, it doesn't sound like you worked a day in your life.
I've never worked a day in my life. Before we started chatting, I wanted to say how fortunate I've been and how lucky a lot of us are. But in my case, I had 46 years of flying, and not one day was a negative. I was never influenced by anything negative. And I really, my heart goes out to all the pilots in Ireland now that have been subjected to such terrible situations in the last 18 months. And I wish against anything that the recovery is quick and it benefits everyone in aviation that has been so badly hurt by this situation. So I was lucky.
As you say, it's for a lot of people, it's so much a passion as well as a career and a job that's there too.
Absolutely, Michael. And it was a passion to me. If something had stopped me flying as a young guy, I'd have been brokenhearted. So I feel for these young guys that have really been hurt. Shame.
I know you're not flying, that you have the access to aircraft, but can you describe your last 747 flight for me?
Oh, that was a special flight. I was given the roster of choice. I've enjoyed flying to the Far East, but there were lockdowns there which kept me away. So I bid for the easiest and most convenient. And I flew from Luxembourg to Los Angeles, spent a couple of days there. And then my prime destination was a few days in Seattle. And the return flight was from Seattle through Prestwick, where Cargolux still does a couple of flights a day, and then on to Luxembourg. The company was very nice in that the last sector they had arranged without my knowledge that the call sign was actually going to be changed from Cargolux to Noel. So I didn't know it. And after takeoff, when we contacted London, they called Noel. So you can imagine the confusion on my face, but lovely. It was a very special last flight, and I'll miss it, of course. But as I mentioned to you, Michael, we've moved to Ireland. Love it. I can't wait to explore the island, which I haven't done yet, of course. But that's made up for a lot, and look forward to. You'll
certainly enjoy that, especially from the air as well. Are you a sentimental man? Was it a heart-wrenching moment to walk off the flight deck?
Yeah, it was. I wouldn't be honest if I said it wasn't. I love my job. I spent a third of every month in the simulator. I did a lot of training, and so when I went flying, it was lovely. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and we had nice colleagues. So it was a sad day to shut down for the last time. And I've thought about what it was, Michael. I'll certainly not miss checking into hotels or packing suitcases or going through security. But it's the joy of flying the airplane, of the joy of traveling, and experiencing that airplane specifically in my mind. I know a lot of Airbus guys would laugh at me now, but that airplane specifically was something special to not be allowed to operate again. That's my restriction, I suppose. It gets me.
Did you enjoy instructing?
Loved it. I really did enjoy it. And I got into instruction in, just before I left SAA, a little bit in the Air Force. But I was lucky enough to be influenced by a lot of fine people that made me interested in instructing. And I, interestingly enough, Michael, decided to convert my South African license, to an Irish license for a number of reasons, although I had a frozen ATP in the UK. And the reason I'm telling you that is because when I had to convert my type rating instructor, TRI, and subsequently TRE, onto the Irish license, I was sent an inspector, of course, to do my check ride. And that inspector was a fine gentleman by the name of Captain Noel OBrien. And I, from day one, every time he demonstrated or showed or advised, I realized there was a knack to this occupation of instructing or examining that can be positive, that can be beneficial, and that can be enjoyable. And that really got me, and I thought this is the way to do it. And I'll forever be thankful for him. And what a small world, Michael. He's now my neighbor. And it's amazing after all these years. There I bumped into Mike. So these are the men, and there are many that I would hate to ignore, any fine instructors that have influenced certainly me, that thought this is a nice way to train.
Have you seen a change of style from the 1970s in instruction to today? Much more in the positivity, the positive learning.
Oh, well said, Michael. Very much so. It was trained by stick in the old days, and of course there's pros and cons to everything. But this new approach is very nice. It's open-minded. It carries responsibility of both the instructor and the student. The student has to provide her bit as well. Do your homework, come prepared. And it makes it a pleasure. It makes it most enjoyable. And of course, the onset of, in basic terms, crew resource management has been ever important, because that was ignored until, as you know better than I do, the late 70s. And so the introduction and combination of both CRM into basic technical training has been a fantastic step forward for everybody. Let's
talk about the other aeroplane in your life. I was going to say the other woman in your life, the DC-3.
Oh, gee, what a splendid. A lot of my colleagues in the South African Airforce went and flew DC-3s. And it was a lure because as I mentioned earlier, I had this airline in my mind. But the jets were a bit stronger. So I thought I'd lost out, and I'd love to have flown a DC-3. And yet the surprise all came with a phone call in 2015 with a friend of ours in Germany who said a colleague of his wanted to buy a DC-3. And I thought, there's only one guy I'd want to get hold of, and that was a chap called Flip Vermeulen in South Africa. And he had started the South African Airways historic flight, and subsequently had moved on to develop his own company in Springbox Classic Air, and they had a few DC-3s. When I phoned him, he said his DC-3 is for sale, and there started the story. The sale went through. This friend of ours bought the DC-3, and we actually flew it up, Michael, from Joburg to Germany. That's a story that would take days.
That's a separate episode, I'm guessing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, we might do that.
Oh, absolutely. It's very, very entertaining. And it took us 11 days. But when we got the airplane to Germany, we inundated with people that wanted access to it. But the biggest problem came from getting the airplane registered, because the owner wanted it on an AOC, and that complicated the issue. Mm-hmm. However, I was chatting to my brother Hugh, who was at that time CEO of ASL Aviation, and also a director with the IHF, the Irish Heritage Flight Foundation. And they expressed interest to have this airplane on site in Ireland. And that culminated in meetings with Hugh actually the CEO of Aer Lingus, Stephen Kavanagh, and Michael Healy. And the plan was put in stone, and it actually worked. And that is, we brought the aeroplane to Shannon, where she was repainted into the colours of Aer Lingus, or retro colours of Aer Lingus, and looked absolutely beautiful. What a joy. We left the aeroplane in Shannon for 6 weeks. She got painted, and we went back about 5 days before the Bray show in 2017 to collect her. And this aeroplane rolled out of the ASL hangar. It looked spectacular. And it was a very unique DC-3 because it only had 12,500 hours total time on it.
Wow.
And the reason being, after being built in the States, it was given to the Royal Air Force, who seconded it to the South African Airforce to fly troops in the Second World War back from Cairo to South Africa, and then put in storage for many, many, many years. Then used as a training platform, I should say, for navigator training in the South African Air Force. Subsequently, back to storage, thereafter bought by chap Flippy, who converted it to the registration Zulu Sierra November Tango Echo, which she was when we brought her across here. After picking her up, we brought her to Dublin Airport, which was really very interesting in the DC-3 in the busy airspace that wish we could have today. And we did an introduction to Aer Lingus, and we did some flying from Dublin Airport, obviously with local contact support. We flew down the River Liffey at about 1,500 feet, down over Bray to see where we'd be performing. But, amongst people that came to have a ride with us was the same Captain Michael O'Brien, who drove miles to get to the aeroplane on time, and also a lady by the name of Margaret McClune, who was a stewardess on DC-3s with Aer Lingus in, I do think it was between 1952 and 1955. So special. Yeah, it was a special aeroplane.
What is it about that aircraft that just lifts people's hearts? It's the shape, it's the sound, it's everything, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And the reliability, and of course, it when you think back to the manufacturing of an airplane that size, to be so reliable in those days is just phenomenal. And what caught me, being spoilt, and we lose the wonderful atmosphere and romanticism of these airplanes, is starting a jumbo as 2 switches, even less on an Airbus. But getting those engines started, the old Pratt & Whitneys on the DC-3 was really special, and one had to be very cautious to enable longevity of the engine. We'd start the engines after a while, and you wouldn't move the airplane for 10 minutes to slowly warm up and get everything. I think I remember one of the mechanics telling us there was something like 900 moving parts in that engine. Don't rush anything.
Don't rush anything. My favorite DC-3 story was standing beside one once and noticing an oil leak coming from the engine. And the pilot said to me, he said, "We only worry if you can't see that. It means there's no oil left."
well, me being a real clot, my first day flying, I had a nice white shirt on and everyone laughed. Okay. I didn't know what they were laughing at, but of course the joke was on me at the end of the flight. It was a black shirt, yeah.
You got to fly this, of course, at Bray and Foynes.
Michael, after the introduction to Aer Lingus, that was in July 2017, we took the aeroplane to Weston, where we kept her as a base. They introduced her to all the members and followers of the IHFF. And then that weekend, the Saturday, I think it was the 22nd of July 2017, we flew down to Shannon, waited for our slot, and then did a display at Foynes, which itself, what wonderful history we learned while we were actually waiting at Shannon for this display. And then after the Foynes display, we flew back to Weston. However, we changed our minds on the way back, that we thought wasting time by landing, restarting, and we'd just stay airborne. And excuse the story that we were given a call sign of Shamrock 1947. And of course, we tried to say Shamrock with pride, with as much an Irish accent as we could, but not that it worked. But ATC must have thought we were locals, because we said, look, we'd like to change our plan and we'd like to hold somewhere, please, until we can do our show at Bray. And the guy said, yeah, hold at Joe's Bridge. I'm making that up. So we searched charts and we looked. And of course, he was talking to local references. We were looking at VORs and NDB. So
you could have been told the glass houses and it would have meant as much to you in the same way.
Yeah.
You fired a lot of memories that day, I think, in Bray when it flew down the beach, because I was certainly talking to some of the people in the crowd afterwards, and they just said they remembered grandparents flying on it or going out to the airport to see the aeroplane. It was a good idea, wasn't it, to get it in the Aer Lingus colours? It worked.
Oh, Michael, absolutely fantastic. The support, of course, person to person after landing in Western was unbelievable. People had driven from all over Ireland to see this, and everyone had a story as to why they wanted to see this airplane. And the history behind it, if I remember correctly, Aer Lingus flew them right up until 1964. And what a machine. But the colours, I think that airplane will never look as beautiful and as proud as she did in those Aer Lingus colours. The tragedy is the airplane has been sold now, and the owner, I think, ran out of the huge effort of getting this registered on an AOC. So I wouldn't like to commit as to where we go with the airplane now, but it seems unlikely that we'll be able to follow the same lovely protocols that we had. And the plans, if I may, the opportunity was presented by the fantastic efforts that Bernard Cullen has done at Ballyboy. We first flew up to have a look at the airfield and realized it would be a little bit tight operating even at lower weights, the DC-3 in and out of Ballyboy. Bernard immediately went down to moving some trees, but that still didn't present a platform on which we could base a safe operation. Looking at it today, oh man, it is absolutely beautiful what he has done. And so I'm somewhat reticent to say I'm not what chances we have of getting NTE back, subject to what we get to agreements with the new owner. But it'll be sad if we don't have her back here in these colours in Ireland. Beautiful, beautiful aeroplane.
Noel, what are you going to do for your flying fix?
Oh man, I've had 3 months off now, Michael, since retirement, and the bugs got me. The company's asked me to go back and do some simulator training, but of course, due restrictions, that's not possible. I think, I have to tell you, I'm somewhat embarrassed. I renewed my SEP rating in October last year, and I terrified an instructor when I tried to flare at 50 feet. Something I'm going to have to get used to.
That's the pilot's height flaring the 747, I'm guessing, yeah?
Yeah, you flare at 50 feet latest, and your height, your head's probably 80, 90 feet. So it wasn't a wise thing to do on a Cessna 172. So the first thing I will do, Michael, is get some training and get myself more competent on an SEP again, and I'll take it from there. But I can't leave aviation alone. There's just too much, and the enthusiasm in Ireland for aviation is so lovely. I've even, if I may say, your podcast is just wonderful, to read so many blogs, aviation in Ireland. I'm so motivated that one can't leave it alone, and I won't be able to, but we'll see where this takes us.
Well, Noel, I have a funny feeling we will be talking to you again, but maybe we get to do it on an airfield, near an airplane, or under a wing. And I look forward to hearing the story of the delivery from South Africa to Germany of a DC-3. That sounds like there's a yarn in there or two.
There's a lot to be said. Michael, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. And as I say, I'm somewhat humbled by the other esteemed comments you've had and commentators that you've had on the program. Much appreciated. I've enjoyed the time chatting with you.
Well, it does prove there's some good folk around aviation. Noel, thank you so much indeed.
And to you, Michael. Thank you. Bye-bye.